The wind was a thief in the Whisperwood. It stole the warmth from Alara's fingers and the courage from her heart, leaving behind the familiar chill of bone-deep solitude. She pulled her threadbare cloak tighter, the scent of damp moss and drying herbs clinging to the wool. This was her world, a small stone cottage insulated by forest, a life lived on the fringes, just beyond the reach of pack law and the memory of men. She was a healer, a herbalist, an outcast. The titles were all the same to her. They meant she was alone, and being alone meant being safe. Her gaze swept the forest floor, eyes trained by years of practice to see what others missed. A patch of silverleaf nestled beneath a fern, a cluster of duskroot clinging to the base of an ancient oak. She moved with quiet efficiency, her worn leather pouch gradually filling with the day's harvest. It was a simple life, a predictable one. The forest provided, and she asked for nothing more. A snap of a branch, loud as a thunderclap in the evening stillness, broke the peace. Alara froze, every muscle tensed. It was not a deer, not a fox. The sound was too heavy, too careless. It was the sound of something large and wounded. Her first instinct, the one that had kept her alive for 10 years, was to flee, to melt back into the shadows of her cottage and bar the door. Whatever was out there, it was not her concern. The pack, the town, the world beyond her woods. They had cast her out long ago. She owed them nothing. But then came another sound. A low, pained groan that was not entirely animal. It was a sound of suffering, and the healer in her could not ignore it. It was a weakness she knew. Her compassion. It was the one part of her old life she had never managed to excise. Parakke. She moved toward the sound, silent as a ghost. Each step was a debate, a war between her fear and her nature. The trees grew thicker here, their branches weaving a dense canopy that starved the light. In the gathering gloom, she saw it. A beast. It was a wolf, but a wolf of impossible size. Its fur was the color of midnight, thick and matted with blood and grime. It lay on its side, massive chest heaving with shallow, ragged breaths. One of its forelegs was twisted at an unnatural angle, and a dark, viscous fluid pooled on the dead leaves beneath it. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her. This was no ordinary wolf. This was one of them. A shifter. And a powerful one, judging by its sheer scale. Her hand instinctively went to the small blade she kept at her belt, a tool for cutting roots, not for defense. It would be useless. The beast's head lifted, a motion of pure agony. Its eyes found hers. They were not the eyes of a wild animal. They were intelligent, aware, and filled with a pain so profound it stole her breath. They were gold. Molten, liquid gold, flickering like dying embers in the twilight. She should have run. Every sensible part of her screamed it. A shifter this deep in her woods, this wounded, meant trouble. It meant packs and politics and violence. Everything she had run from. But the golden eyes held her. They did not threaten. They did not command. They pleaded. And Alara, the outcast, the ghost of the Whisperwood, found she could not refuse. She took a slow, deliberate step forward, hands raised to show they were empty. "I won't hurt you," she whispered, her voice barely a rustle of leaves. The sound was absurd, a tiny human whispering promises to a monster. The wolf's head sank back to the ground, a gesture of exhaustion or, perhaps, acceptance. Its golden eyes never left her face. This was a mistake. She knew it with a certainty that settled like a stone in her gut. A terrible, life-altering mistake. Slowly, cautiously, she knelt beside the great beast, the scent of blood and winter and something else, something like ozone after a lightning strike, filled her senses. Her training took over, pushing the fear to a manageable distance. She was a healer. This was a patient. Nothing more. Her fingers, surprisingly steady, probed the matted fur around the wounded leg. The bone was shattered. A clean break would have been better. This was a mess of splintered fragments and torn muscle. She could smell infection, the sweet, sickly odor of decay already setting in. But there was something else wrong, something deeper. Her hand hovered over the wolf's massive flank, and she felt it. A coldness. Not the chill of the evening air, but an unnatural, deathly frost that seemed to emanate from within the beast itself. It was a creeping rot, a slow decay that had nothing to do with the broken leg. What was this thing? The wolf let out another low groan, a tremor shaking its powerful frame. The golden eyes were clouded now, the light in them fading. It was dying. Not just from the leg, but from this internal winter. She had to move it. She could do nothing for it here. Her cottage was a quarter-mile away, a lifetime away. She was strong, but not strong enough to move a creature that must have weighed more than a draft horse. "You have to help me," she murmured, her breath a cloud of white in the air. She placed her palm flat against its broad head, a gesture of comfort she had used on countless frightened animals. "If you can understand me, you have to shift. I can't help you like this." There was a flicker of understanding in those golden eyes, a spark of the formidable intelligence she had glimpsed before. A low growl rumbled in its chest, but it was not a threat. It was a sound of immense effort. The air crackled with a sudden pressure. The world seemed to warp around the beast, the shadows deepening and twisting. She heard the sickening crunch of bones reshaping, the tearing of flesh reforming. Alara scrambled back, her heart hammering against her ribs, unable to look away. It was a brutal, violent magic, a transformation born of agony. Where the giant wolf had been, a man now lay sprawled on the forest floor. He was naked, his body a roadmap of scars old and new. He was huge, broad-shouldered and powerfully built even in his brokenness. His hair was as black as the wolf's fur, plastered to his sweat-slicked brow. And his face, it was harsh, all sharp angles and unforgiving lines, a face carved from granite and command. Even unconscious, he radiated an aura of absolute power. But he was also broken. His leg was bent at the same horrifying angle, the bone pushing against the skin. The unnatural cold still clung to him, a visible frost forming on his skin despite the lingering heat of the transformation. And Alara knew, with a sinking dread that eclipsed all her previous fear, exactly who she had found. She had seen his likeness on coins, on faded proclamations tacked to the trees at the edge of her woods. The sharp jaw, the proud nose, the eyes that were said to be made of gold. She had brought the Alpha King into her world. Panic seized her. She should leave him. Now. Dragging him to her cottage was madness. It was suicide. The world would come looking for him. His guards, his enemies, his pack. They would descend on her quiet life and tear it apart. She looked down at his face, slack with pain. A tremor ran through him, and a low whimper escaped his lips. It was such a human sound, a sound of pure misery. The king had vanished, and only a dying man remained. Damn her compassionate heart. She couldn't leave him. Summoning strength she didn't know she possessed, she managed to get her small, sturdy herb cart. It was a struggle, a nightmare of grunting effort and whispered curses, but she eventually maneuvered his dead weight onto it. He was too long, his legs dangling off the end, his head lolling to the side. The journey back to her cottage was a blur of pain and fear. The cart's wooden wheels groaned in protest, threatening to splinter under the impossible load. Every jolt sent a fresh wave of agony through him, and his unconscious groans were a constant, terrible counterpoint to the quiet sounds of the forest. By the time she reached her small clearing, night had fallen completely. The windows of her cottage glowed with the warm, welcoming light of a single candle she had left burning. It looked like a haven, a sanctuary. She knew it was about to become a prison. Getting him inside was another ordeal. She half-dragged, half-carried him to her simple cot, his weight nearly crushing her. He fell onto the straw mattress with a heavy thud, his broken leg striking the floor with a sickening crack. A raw scream tore from his throat, and his eyes flew open. For a terrifying second they were lucid. The golden eyes of the king, sharp and furious, burned into her. "Who?" he rasped, his hand weakly trying to form a fist. "Be still," she said, her voice firmer than she felt. "You're safe. I'm a healer." The fire in his eyes dimmed, replaced by a confused haze. He looked at her, at the unfamiliar ceiling of her cottage, at his own broken body. Then his eyes rolled back in his head, and he was gone again. Alara stood there, her body trembling with adrenaline and exhaustion, her hands covered in his blood. The most powerful man in the kingdom was lying broken in her bed. She took a deep, steadying breath, the familiar scent of dried lavender and chamomile filling her lungs. The panic receded, replaced by the calm focus of her craft. He was a patient. That was all. She would fix his leg. She would fight the cold. And then she would make him leave. She worked through the night. She lit every candle she owned, casting the small room in a flickering golden glow. She set his leg, a gruesome task that involved forcing the splintered bones back into alignment. He screamed in his delirium, his body thrashing, and she had to use all her weight to hold him down. She bound the leg tightly with splints and clean linen, her touch sure and practiced despite the trembling in her hands. Then she turned to the cold. It was worse now, a visible rime of frost spreading from his chest. His skin was like ice. His breath was a white plume in the warm air of the cottage. This was a magic she didn't understand, a sickness beyond her knowledge. She did what she could. She brewed a steaming tea of fever bark and sun thistle, forcing the hot liquid past his clenched teeth. She packed hot stones wrapped in cloth around his body, trying to fight the encroaching winter with simple heat. She worked tirelessly, her own exhaustion a distant hum. In the gray hours before dawn, as she was changing the dressing on his leg, she noticed one of her work shoes was missing. The sturdy leather shoe, worn and comfortable, was gone. She searched the small cottage, her mind foggy with fatigue. It was nowhere. She must have lost it in the forest during the struggle with the cart. She sighed, too tired to care. It was just a shoe. She slumped into a wooden chair beside the cot, watching the king's chest rise and fall. His breathing was still shallow, but it was steady. The frost had receded slightly, held at bay by her efforts. He was still dying, she knew. This was a temporary reprieve. But he was alive. She had saved the Alpha King, and she was sure it was going to ruin her. For 3 days, the world was the size of her cottage. It was the scent of antiseptic herbs, the sound of his ragged breathing, the feel of his impossibly cold skin. He drifted in and out of consciousness, muttering names she didn't know and places she had only heard of in whispers. Lyra, the sunken city, the Shadow Pass. She learned the rhythms of his fever. She learned the way his brow would furrow just before a wave of pain hit. The slight tremor in his hand that signaled the cold was gaining ground. She saw him not as a king, but as a man. A broken, vulnerable man, stripped of all his power. And a strange, unwelcome feeling began to take root in her heart. It wasn't pity. It was a dangerous, terrifying empathy. She saw the deep lines of exhaustion etched around his eyes, the silver strands woven into his black hair, and she wondered what burdens he carried that were heavier than his crown. On the 4th morning, something changed. The air outside, which had been still and silent, was suddenly filled with noise, the thunder of hooves, the jangling of armor, the sharp, commanding shouts of men. They had found her. Ilara's blood ran cold. She looked at the king, still lost in his fevered sleep. She had one wild, insane thought of hiding him, of somehow concealing this giant of a man from his own search party. It was impossible. Her quiet life was over. The door to her cottage burst open without a knock. It slammed against the stone wall, shaking the drying herbs from the rafters. 2 men clad in black and silver armor filled the doorway. They were huge, their presence sucking the air from the small room. Their eyes, hard and suspicious, swept over the cottage before landing on her. Then they saw the man on the cot. "Your Majesty," one of them breathed, his professional hardness dissolving into pure relief. They moved past her as if she were a piece of furniture, their attention solely on their king. One of them knelt beside the cot, his hand gently touching the king's forehead. The other turned to her, his face a mask of suspicion. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice a low growl. "What have you done to him?" Before she could answer, a third man entered the cottage. He was older, his face lined with worry, but he carried the same aura of command as the others. He wore the sigil of the Royal Guard captain on his breastplate. His eyes took in the scene in an instant. His fallen king, the splinted leg, the herbs and potions scattered around the room. His gaze settled on her. It was sharp, assessing, and held no warmth. "I am Captain Boren," he said, his voice clipped. "You will explain yourself. Now." But then he stopped. His eyes had fallen on the king's bedside. There, placed carefully beside his master's unconscious hand, was a single, worn leather shoe. Her shoe. Boren looked from the shoe to her own feet, where its partner sat, scuffed and mud-stained. His expression shifted from suspicion to confusion. "The beast. It carried this back to the castle," he murmured, almost to himself. "Dropped it at the foot of the throne and collapsed. We didn't know what it meant. So that's what had happened. The wolf, delirious and dying, had taken a part of her with him, a token, a marker to lead his men back to his savior, or his captor." The king stirred on the cot, his eyes fluttering open. This time, they were clear. The fever had broken. He looked at Captain Boren, then at the other guards. His gaze swept the room, finally landing on her. She stood frozen, a deer caught in the glare of a hunter's lantern. She expected anger, accusation, or worse, dismissal. Instead, his golden eyes softened. He saw the fear in her face, the exhaustion in the slump of her shoulders. He remembered the pain, the forest, the quiet voice and gentle hands that had pulled him back from the brink. He tried to sit up, wincing as pain shot through his leg. "Enough, Boren," he rasped, his voice weak but still resonant with authority. "She saved my life." The captain's jaw tightened, but he gave a short, stiff bow. The king's gaze returned to her. He held it, a silent communication that sent a jolt through her. It was a look of gratitude, of curiosity, and something else she couldn't name. Something that made her skin tingle. "What is your name, healer?" he asked, his voice softer now. "Ilara," she whispered. "Ilara," he repeated, the name a strange and wonderful thing on his lips. He looked at the guards, then back at her. A decision had been made. She comes with us. It was not a request. Panic flared in her chest. "No," she said, the word out before she could stop it. "I cannot. My place is here." The king's expression didn't change, but a flicker of something hard and unyielding entered his eyes. It was the first glimpse she had of the ruler beneath the patient. "Your place is where I say it is," he stated, the words quiet but absolute. "I am not healed. The cold. It is still inside me. Your herbs helped. You helped. My royal physicians have failed for months. You will continue my treatment at the castle." Captain Boren looked aghast. "Your Majesty, she is a commoner, an outcast. We cannot bring her into the royal court." "You can," the king said, his voice gaining a dangerous edge of steel. "And you will. She is under my protection. Anyone who questions it will answer to me." He looked directly at Ilara, his golden eyes pinning her in place. "I am not asking." The boundary was drawn, her quiet, safe world on one side and the vast, terrifying world of the Alpha King on the other. And he was dragging her across it, whether she wanted to go or not. The journey to the castle was a surreal nightmare. She was bundled into a covered wagon, ostensibly for her comfort, but she knew it was to keep her hidden. She sat on a plush velvet bench, her simple homespun dress looking absurdly out of place. The king, Valerius, traveled in a litter carried by his strongest guards, his splinted leg propped on silk pillows. He had insisted she ride close to him. She could see his litter through the wagon's small window, a constant, looming presence. They didn't speak, but she felt his awareness of her, a palpable connection that stretched across the space between them. The castle was a monster of gray stone that clawed at the sky. It was a fortress, a symbol of power designed to intimidate and awe. It made her feel small, insignificant, and terribly exposed. Guards in black and silver snapped to attention as their procession passed through the massive gates. The air hummed with a disciplined energy that was utterly alien to her. She was taken not to the dungeons, as she had half expected, but to a suite of rooms adjoining the king's own chambers. They were luxurious, filled with rich tapestries, polished wood, and soft furs. A fire crackled in a massive stone hearth. It was more space than she had occupied in her entire life, and it felt like a cage. A stern-faced woman named Marta was assigned as her attendant. Marta made it clear through her tight lips and disapproving glares that she considered Alara an unwelcome intrusion. "His Majesty requires your presence," Marta announced on the first evening, her voice dripping with disdain. Alara's heart hammered. She followed the woman through a heavy oak door into the king's chambers. The room was vast, dominated by a bed so large it could have held 10 men. Valerius was propped up against a mountain of pillows, his bandaged leg resting on a stool. The unnatural cold she had felt in the forest was more pronounced here, seeming to suck the warmth from the roaring fire. He had dismissed his guards. They were alone. "Come closer," he commanded, his voice quiet. She approached the bed, her hands clutching each other. She felt like a fraud. She was a simple herbalist, skilled in setting bones and brewing poultices. The sickness that afflicted him was a deep, dark magic she couldn't even begin to understand. "How do you feel?" she asked, falling back on the familiar role of healer. A humorless smile touched his lips. "I feel like a block of ice with a shattered leg. The royal physicians have been fluttering around me all day, poking and prodding. They say I should be dead." His golden eyes locked onto hers. "Why am I not?" The question hung in the air between them. She had no answer. I only did what I could," she stammered. "The herbs, the heat." "It's not the herbs," he said, his voice dropping lower. "It's you." He gestured to the empty space beside him on the bed. "Sit." She hesitated. This was too much, too intimate. "It is not a request, Alara," he said, the steel back in his voice, but his eyes were pleading. "Please." The please undid her. Kings did not say please. She perched on the edge of the mattress, her spine ramrod straight, careful not to touch him. "When you are near," he said, his voice a low murmur, "the cold recedes. It's quieter. The pain is less." He closed his eyes, a look of profound weariness on his face. "For the first time in a year, I don't feel like I'm actively dying." A year. This thing had been eating him alive for a year. She looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw the truth of it. The subtle hollowness of his cheeks, the dark circles under his eyes that even his power couldn't conceal. He was hiding it from his kingdom, from his own men. A dying king was a weak king, and weakness was a death sentence. "I don't understand," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I have no magic." "Don't you?" he asked, his eyes opening again. He reached out and, before she could pull away, his fingers brushed her hand. A jolt, like lightning, shot up her arm. It wasn't a magical shock, but a purely physical one. His skin was freezing, but where his fingers touched hers, she felt a strange, inexplicable warmth bloom. He flinched back as if burned, his eyes wide with surprise. He stared at his own hand, then back at her. "What was that?" I don't know," she breathed, her heart racing. He had brought her here as his healer, a living remedy for his incurable disease. But as the days turned into weeks, the lines began to blur. The boundary she had so desperately tried to maintain, the one between healer and patient, between outcast and king, began to erode. Their sessions were no longer just about medicine. He would insist she sit with him for hours, long after she had changed his dressings and administered his herbal tonics. He would ask her about the forest, about the names and uses of the herbs she grew. At first, she gave clipped, reluctant answers. But he was a persistent man. He listened, truly listened. No one had ever done that before. He was fascinated by her knowledge, by the simple, self-sufficient world she had built for herself. In return, he spoke of his own world, not of politics or war, but of the crushing weight of the crown, the loneliness of the throne. He never spoke of the curse, the cold that was killing him, but it was a constant presence in the room, a third person in their conversations. "They see the Alpha King," he said one night, his voice laced with a bitterness that surprised her. He gestured vaguely toward the door, beyond which his kingdom lay. "They don't see the man. They see power. They don't see the cost." She found herself looking forward to their time together, a fact that terrified her. She was coming to care for this impossible, demanding, lonely man. She saw the flashes of the ruthless king the world knew, but she also saw the vulnerable patient she had found in the woods. They were two sides of the same coin, and she was beginning to fall for both of them. One evening, he was in more pain than usual. His leg ached, and the cold was biting deep. She had made a powerful pain-relieving salve, and she knelt beside his bed to apply it. Her hands worked gently on his skin, massaging the balm into the still healing flesh around the break. He was watching her, his golden eyes intense. "You have gentle hands," he murmured. She didn't look up, her cheeks flushing with heat. "I am a healer." "No," he said. "Many healers have touched me. Their hands are skilled. Yours are kind." His hand came up and cupped her jaw, his touch shockingly cold but surprisingly gentle. He tilted her head up, forcing her to meet his gaze. The room was silent except for the crackle of the fire and the frantic beating of her own heart. "I need you, Alara," he whispered. And the words were raw, torn from a place of deep, desperate honesty. It wasn't a confession of love, not yet. It was a confession of something far more frightening to a man like him. It was a confession of weakness, of dependence. He was admitting that she, the outcast, the nobody, held a power over him that no one else did. The power to soothe his pain, the power to hold back the dark. He leaned in, his gaze dropping to her lips. She knew she should pull away. She should run from this room, from this castle, and never look back. This was a line she could not uncross. But she didn't move. She was trapped, not by his strength, but by the raw vulnerability in his eyes. His lips met hers. The kiss was not what she expected. It was not the kiss of a conquering king. It was hesitant, searching, almost reverent. It was cold, so cold, a kiss of frost and shadow. But beneath the cold, there was a spark of desperate heat, a flicker of life reaching for warmth. Her warmth. She felt a strange tingling sensation spread through her, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. It started in her chest and radiated outwards, a gentle, pulsing energy she had never felt before. For a brief, magical moment, where his lips touched hers, she felt the chill recede. She felt him become warm. He pulled back, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and wonder. He touched his own lips, then looked at her as if seeing her for the first time. "What?" Before he could say another word, the doors to his chamber were thrown open. "Valerius, darling, I heard you were back among the living. I came as soon as I could." The voice was like honey laced with poison. A woman stood in the doorway, flanked by two of the king's own guards who looked deeply uncomfortable. She was stunningly beautiful, with hair the color of spun gold and eyes as green as emeralds. She wore a gown of deep crimson that clung to her perfect figure, and jewels glittered at her throat and in her hair. But it was her aura that made Alara's blood run cold. It was an aura of cloying, possessive power. Valerius's face hardened, the brief warmth of their moment vanishing as if it had never been. The king was back, cold and absolute. "Isolde," he said, his voice flat and devoid of all emotion. "What are you doing here?" "I came to see my king," she purred, gliding into the room. Her emerald eyes swept over the scene, lingering on Alara with open contempt. "And it seems I arrived just in time to interrupt the help." Lady Isolde, the king's former mate. Alara had heard the whispers from the servants. Isolde had been cast aside a year ago, her bond with the king severed for reasons no one dared speak of. But she was a highborn, from a powerful and ancient family, and she had never truly left the court. She had simply been waiting. Isolde's gaze was a physical blow. It was filled with a venomous hatred that was deeply, terrifyingly personal. And in the depths of those green eyes, Alara saw something else. Recognition. Isolde knew her. A cold dread, far worse than the king's magical chill, washed over Alara. The past she had buried so deep, the life she had fled, was standing before her in a crimson gown. Isolde's family, the House of Volkov, had been her family's sworn enemies for generations. It was Isolde's father who had accused Alara's own father of treason, leading to his execution and the ruin of their name. It was Isolde who had stood and watched, a smug smile on her face, as a 10-year-old Alara was cast out, branded a traitor's daughter. "Well, well," Isolde said, her voice a soft, dangerous hiss. She circled the bed, her eyes never leaving Alara. "Look what the beast dragged in, the little hedge witch, the last of the disgraced House of Alaron. I thought we had swept your kind from the world." Her past had not just caught up with her. It had cornered her in the king's bedroom. Valerius looked from Isolde's triumphant face to Alara's pale, stricken one. Confusion warred with dawning suspicion in his eyes. "What is she talking about, Alara?" "Oh, she didn't tell you?" Isolde laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Our little healer has a history, a rather treasonous one. Her father tried to usurp your throne, Valerius. He paid the price. It seems the daughter has followed in his footsteps, worming her way into your confidence." Every word was a nail in her coffin. Alara couldn't breathe. The room was spinning. "That's a lie," she whispered, but her voice was weak, drowned out by Isolde's venom. "Is it?" Isolde raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "She is an Alaron. That name is synonymous with betrayal. And now she is here, at your side, while you are weak and vulnerable. What a coincidence." She turned her poisonous smile on Valerius, or perhaps it was her magic that brought you down in the first place. The accusation hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Valerius looked at her, his golden eyes now clouded with doubt and pain. He saw a traitor's daughter, the enemy of his kingdom. He saw a lie, the fragile trust they had built, the tender connection they had forged, shattered into a million pieces. The days that followed were a special kind of hell. Isolde had won. She had planted the seed of doubt, and it had taken root in the fertile ground of the king's suspicion. Alara was no longer his confidant. She was his prisoner. She was confined to her rooms, a guard posted at her door. She was still required to attend the king, to brew his teas and apply his salves, but the warmth was gone. Their conversations were stilted, formal. He watched her with guarded, assessing eyes, searching for the traitor Isolde had promised him. It was a torment, to be so close to him, to feel the pull of the connection between them, but to be separated by a wall of lies. She saw the toll it was taking on him. Without the easy intimacy they had shared, the cold was advancing again. The lines of pain were deeper around his eyes. He was weakening, and it was her fault. Isolde was a constant, gloating presence. She had seamlessly reinserted herself into the king's life, positioning herself as his concerned, loyal companion. She would visit him while Ilara was there, her touch lingering on his arm, her voice a constant, soothing murmur in his ear. She treated Ilara with a dismissive cruelty that was more effective than any open hostility. "Bring the king his tea, little witch," she would command, not even looking at her. "And try not to spill any of your family's ambition in it." Ilara bore it all with a quiet, burning rage. She would not give Isolde the satisfaction of seeing her break. But inside, she was crumbling. Her self-doubt, the old companion of her lonely years, returned with a vengeance. What if Isolde was right? What if there was some darkness in her blood she didn't know about? Her power, this strange ability to soothe his cold, felt like a curse. The breaking point came a week later. Ilara had developed a new poultice, using a rare combination of herbs she hoped would combat the magical chill more directly. She was applying it to his chest, her hands moving with practiced care. His skin was like ice. Isolde swept into the room, a triumphant, predatory smile on her face. She was flanked by Captain Boren and 2 other guards. "There!" Isolde cried, pointing a dramatic finger at Ilara. "I knew it! She is poisoning him!" Boren stepped forward and roughly pulled Ilara away from the king. He picked up the small bowl containing the poultice and sniffed it. His face paled. "Nightshade," he said, his voice grim. "Wolfsbane. These are poisons, Your Majesty." Ilara stared in horror. It was impossible. She hadn't used those herbs. She looked at the bowl, then at Isolde. The woman's eyes glittered with victory. She had switched them. Somehow she had swapped Ilara's healing herbs for deadly poisons. "No," Ilara whispered, shaking her head. "It's a lie. I would never—" Valerius pushed himself up in the bed, his face a mask of thunderous fury and deep, profound betrayal. He looked at the herbs. He looked at her. And in that moment, he believed the lie. "Take her to the dungeons," he commanded, his voice a low, guttural growl. The words hit her like a physical blow. "She will be tried for treason and attempted regicide. The sentence is death." The guard seized her arms. She didn't struggle. She was numb. As they dragged her from the room, she looked back one last time. Valerius was watching her, his golden eyes filled not with anger, but with a terrible, hollow despair. He looked like a man who had just sentenced a part of his own soul to die. Isolde stood beside him, her hand resting on his shoulder in a gesture of false comfort. Her smile was the last thing Ilara saw before the heavy doors slammed shut. The dungeon was as cold as the king's curse, a damp stone box deep in the bowels of the castle where the only light was a thin sliver from a grate high above. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and despair. She had lost. Isolde had won. The past had not just caught up to her, it had consumed her. She was going to die here, branded a traitor, just like her father. Days blurred into a miserable, timeless haze. They brought her stale bread and murky water once a day. It was more than her father had gotten, she thought with a bitter pang of irony. She spent the hours reliving every moment with him. The first touch, the shared confidences, the kiss. That one single kiss that had promised so much and ended in ruin. She tried to hate him for believing Isolde, for condemning her without a real trial. But all she could feel was a profound, aching grief for what they had lost. One night she was jolted from a restless sleep by a sound at her cell door. The heavy groan of the lock turning. The door swung open and a figure stood silhouetted in the torchlight of the corridor. It was him, Valerius. He looked terrible, worse than when she had found him in the forest. The cold had taken over completely. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and a fine layer of frost clung to his hair and clothes. He moved with a slow, agonizing stiffness, his every breath a visible plume of white. He was dying, and he was dying fast. He dismissed the guard with a wave of his hand and stumbled into the cell, closing the heavy door behind him. He leaned against it, his chest heaving. "Ilara," he breathed, his voice a hoarse whisper. She scrambled to her feet, her heart a wild, frantic bird in her chest. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice cracking. "Have you come to watch me rot?" Pain, sharp and pure, flashed in his eyes. "No," he said. He took a staggering step toward her, his hand outstretched. "I came because I was wrong." He told her what had happened after they had taken her away. Isolde, believing she had won, had become careless. She had offered him the antidote to Ilara's poison. The price was his throne, his life, his soul. She wanted to reforge their bond, to rule at his side, to own him completely. And she had let it slip. She had admitted to cursing him, to framing Ilara, to orchestrating everything. "I almost killed her," he said, his voice filled with self-loathing. "My wolf, it wanted to tear her throat out. But I am too weak." He looked down at his own trembling, frosted hands. "This curse, it feeds on strong emotions. My rage at her betrayal only made it stronger. It's consuming me." He was a few feet from her now, the cold emanating from him so intense it made her teeth ache. "She holds the only cure, and she will not give it unless I give you to her for punishment and bind myself to her forever." "So you came to say goodbye," Ilara said, her voice flat. "I came to set you free," he corrected, his golden eyes burning with a desperate, feverish light. He fumbled inside his tunic and produced a heavy iron key. "There is a secret passage at the end of the hall. It leads to the river. You can escape. Run. Go back to your forest. Forget you ever met me." She stared at the key, then at him. He was offering her freedom while he stayed here to die. The sheer, stupid nobility of it shattered the last of her anger. "No," she said, her voice firm. He looked confused. "What?" "I will not run," she said. "I will not leave you to her." "You have to," he insisted, his voice rising in desperation. "She will kill you. Your execution is at dawn." "Then we don't have much time," she replied, her own strange calm surprising her. He stared at her, his mind struggling to comprehend her refusal. He saw the resolve in her eyes, the fierce loyalty she was offering him even after he had betrayed her. And he broke. A terrible, shuddering sob escaped him. He collapsed against her, his great weight nearly sending them both to the floor. His arms wrapped around her, pulling her into a crushing, freezing embrace. He buried his face in her hair, his body trembling violently. "I'm sorry," he choked out, the words muffled against her. "Ilara, I am so sorry. I believed her. I doubted you." "I know," she whispered, her own tears starting to fall. She held him, this great dying king, and felt nothing but love. He pulled back just enough to look at her, his hands framing her face. His thumbs, cold as death, brushed away her tears. "I love you," he whispered, the words a final, desperate confession. "I think I have from the moment I saw you in the forest, and it's going to kill me." His lips found hers. It was a kiss of utter despair and absolute love, a kiss of endings and beginnings. It was the kiss of a dying man giving the last of his warmth to the woman he loved. And this time, something happened. The strange warmth she had felt during their first kiss returned, but it was 1,000 times stronger. It wasn't a tingle. It was a flood. A tidal wave of energy surging from the core of her being. It was a silent, deafening roar in her blood. She felt the magic of his curse press in on her. A tangible thing, cold and sharp and hungry. And she felt her own power rise to meet it, not to fight it, but to undo it, to unmake it. It was like listening to a symphony and simply choosing to hear silence. Like looking at a complex knot and seeing it as a straight piece of rope. Her power didn't destroy. It nullified. It returned things to their natural state. The kiss deepened, and the power flowed from her into him, a cleansing, purifying wave. She felt the cold retreat, not in a rush, but in a slow, inexorable tide. She felt the warmth of his skin, the real warmth of blood and life, return beneath her hands. They broke apart, both gasping. The air in the cell no longer plumed with his breath. The frost on his hair had melted, his skin no longer deathly pale. He stared at her, his golden eyes wide with utter shock and dawning hope. He was still weak, still ill, but the curse's death grip had been broken. He touched her face, his fingers tracing the path of her power. What did you do?" "I don't know," she said, her voice filled with awe. She felt different, whole. The part of her that had always felt empty, the part that made her feel worthless and small, was filled with this quiet, immense power. The sound of footsteps in the corridor broke the spell. The guards. Dawn was coming. Valerius's face hardened. He was still weak, but the king was returning. "It's not enough," he said, his voice grim. "It's a reprieve, not a cure. Isolde still holds the key to the curse. As long as she lives, it will return." "Then we face her together," Ilara said, her voice ringing with a confidence she had never known. The guards opened the door to find not a cowering prisoner, but a woman standing beside their king, her hand in his. The king was weak, but his eyes burned with a fire they had not seen in a year. "The execution is cancelled," Valerius announced, his voice echoing in the stone hallway. "By order of the king, Lady Isolde is to be arrested for treason and witchcraft. Bring her to the throne room, now." The throne room was a cavern of tension. The entire court had assembled, drawn by the shocking news. They whispered and stared as Ilara walked beside the king, his arm around her for support. She wore her simple, stained dress, a stark contrast to the silks and velvets of the nobles. She met their hostile, curious gazes without flinching. Isolde was dragged in, her beautiful face contorted with rage and disbelief. "Valerius, what is the meaning of this? Have you gone mad? Arresting me on the word of this filth?" Valerius slowly, painfully lowered himself onto the throne. He looked ancient and frail, but his eyes were pure steel. "Your games are over, Isolde." "You have no proof," she spat. "I have her," he said, his gaze softening as it fell on Ilara. "And I have my own memory. You confessed. You cursed me. You framed an innocent woman." Isolde threw back her head and laughed, a chilling, unhinged sound. "You think that matters? You are dying, old man. The curse is woven into your very soul. Only I can undo it. Kill me, and you die. Let me go, and I will still have my price. Your crown, your life," and her head on a spike. The court gasped. It was an open declaration of war. "You are right," Valerius said, his voice dangerously quiet. "I am dying." He looked at Ilara, a universe of love and regret in his eyes. "But I will not trade my kingdom, or my queen, for a few more wretched years." My queen. The words settled over the silent court like a blanket of snow. Isolde's face twisted into a mask of pure fury. "Then die," she screamed, and she raised her hands. Dark, sickly green energy swirled around her, coalescing into a shimmering spear of light aimed directly at the king's heart. The guards were too far away. The court was frozen in terror. Ilara didn't think. She acted. She stepped in front of the throne, shielding Valerius with her own body. "Ilara, no!" he cried, reaching for her. She raised her hand, not in defiance, but in simple acceptance. She felt the wave of dark magic wash over her. It was a vile, corrupting force, designed to tear a soul apart. But it found nothing to corrupt. Her power, her nullification met the wave. It didn't block it. It didn't reflect it. It simply unmade it. The sickly green light dissolved into nothingness a foot from her hand. The air cleared. The oppressive energy vanished. Silence. Utter, profound silence. Everyone stared, their minds unable to process what they had just seen. Isolde's jaw dropped. "How?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "That's impossible. No one can stop a soul lance." "She can," Valerius said, his voice filled with awe and pride. Ilara took a step toward Isolde, then another. With every step she felt the curse that bound the king to his torment weakening, unraveling. It was tied to Isolde, to her life, her power. And Ilara was simply turning it off. Isolde stumbled backward, her face a mask of terror. The jewels at her throat seemed to dim. The vibrant color of her gown faded. Her power was being drained, unmade, by Ilara's mere presence. "Stay back!" Isolde shrieked, her voice losing its melodic quality, becoming a harsh, grating squawk. Ilara kept walking. She reached the panicked woman and gently placed her hand on her arm. Isolde screamed. But it was not a scream of pain, it was a scream of loss. The dark magic she had cultivated for decades, the power she had used to curse a king and ruin a family, evaporated like mist in the morning sun. It flowed out of her, not into Ilara, but into nothing, into silence. When Ilara removed her hand, Isolde collapsed to the floor. She was just a woman, a beautiful, terrified woman with nothing left but her own bitterness. The power was gone. The curse was broken. On the throne, Valerius took a deep, shuddering breath. Color flooded back into his face. He pushed himself to his feet, standing tall and straight, his leg no longer troubling him. The cold was gone. The king had returned. He walked down the steps of the dais and stopped in front of Ilara. The entire court held its breath. He looked at her, his golden eyes shining with a love so powerful it was a physical force. He knelt. The Alpha King knelt before the outcast healer in her worn, simple dress. He took her hand, the one that had just unmade a curse, and he raised it to his lips. "My queen," he said, his voice ringing through the silent hall. "You saved me." "You saved me first," she whispered, her eyes filling with happy tears. "You sent your beast to find me." Weeks later, the castle was a different place. The fear that had lingered for a year was gone, replaced by a palpable sense of hope and joy. The story of the hedge witch who had saved the king had spread throughout the kingdom, a modern fairy tale. Isolde, stripped of her titles and power, was imprisoned in the highest tower, her beauty fading with each passing day, left with nothing but the memory of the power she had lost. Ilara stood on a balcony overlooking the capital city. The sun was warm on her face. She wore a simple but elegant gown of deep forest green, a gift from the king. She was still not used to the fine fabrics, the servants, the title. Queen Ilara. It sounded like someone else's name. A pair of strong, warm arms wrapped around her from behind. A familiar chin rested on her shoulder. "What is my beautiful queen thinking about so seriously?" Valerius murmured in her ear. "I'm thinking," she said, leaning back into his embrace, "that my cottage must be getting very dusty." He chuckled, a rich, happy sound she had come to adore. "I'll have it cleaned for you, or we can build you a new one. 1,000 new ones. Anything you want." She turned in his arms to face him. He looked younger, the lines of pain and worry erased from his face. His golden eyes were warm and full of life. He was no longer the dying patient or the cold king. He was just Valerius, her Valerius. "I have everything I want right here," she said, her hand coming up to cup his cheek. He leaned in and kissed her, a long, slow kiss full of warmth and promise. It was the kiss of a man who had been given a second chance at life and love, and knew exactly how precious it was. She was no longer the outcast. He was no longer the lonely king. They had found each other in the dark woods, two broken souls who had managed to heal each other. She had saved him from his curse, and he had saved her from her past. Together, they were whole. And their story was just beginning.